let me introduce our first speaker from Transforming Collections. Her name is, sorry, I put a pronoun to you, Termina Coscar from Transforming Collections. Is going to be presenting about learning the biased languages of benevolence, equity, and the machine. Termina is a postdoctoral research fellow at the HRC Fund Transforming Collections project. She is also a curator, museologist, and material culture historian. She's a research curator at the Museum of Cornish Life, fellow of the Museums Association, and honorary fellow or research fellow at Swansea University. She speaks and publishes widely on decolonizing approaches, ethics, collection histories, and curatorial education. More recently, Museums Will Forget, critical approaches to a catalog central historical research collections. That's your recent publication. Termina, when you're ready, feel free to start sharing your screen, and I will mute myself.
Thanks, Javier. Can you see my screen fully?
Perfect. Full screen.
Brilliant.
All good.
So thank you so much for inviting me to give one of these webinars. And thank you very much for your generous introduction. I wanted to talk a bit about how two aspects of my research have are starting to come together. One is the interest in using digital tools not to solve problems necessarily, but to help answer big research questions that have been ongoing in the museum world for a long time. And the other one is to understand what that means in today's cultural and social and political context. We have entered, I believe, an age of hypersensitivity to language and words, used within manufactured contexts and manipulated out of context in ways where common understanding can often be entirely absent. We see it daily, and it's affecting how we think about ourselves and our beliefs and others and their beliefs. It's the reason why museums have begun scrutinizing their gallery labels and catalogue descriptions, and why language and terminology usage remains a top concern among art museums today. And it is also essential to the work of the Transforming Collections teams. When I started on the project, I was struck by the way in which certain texts were automatically assumed to be problematic, and suggested we think about problematizing texts instead, as that's what we need to do if we want to better understand the purpose and power of language when describing and interpreting art. My strand within the Transforming Collections project is entitled Patterns of Patronage. It aims to reveal the structures, relationships, and mechanisms used in the creation of public art collections. A significant part of this research has been to analyse acquisition methods. I want to use this acquisitions data to answer two systemic questions. First, how are public collections of art created? Second, what role do donors, funders, artists, curators, and others play in the acquisition of art by those public collections? As this project is principally concerned with surfacing bias and throwing spanners into the machine of assumptions, my particular role is to reveal the power and money structures that prop up art collections, principally at the moment of acquisition. During the first stage of my research, I analysed the acquisition methods of the 3,767 artworks by racialised artists audited by Ananda Rutherford and Anjali Dalal Clayton in 2022. This data derived from the typical so-called tombstone records of 31 public, national and civic collections. Entries for acquisition method were terse, hidden in a field called notes, which masked the sheer complexities and numbers of people that could be involved in making a single acquisition happen. Initially, I used techniques borrowed from grounded theory. This is a social science methodology used to construct hypotheses through the collection and analysis of qualitative data. I then used a form of qualitative coding to re-establish the complexities hidden behind the smoothed out acquisition data. I was particularly grateful to Peakscraft for introducing these methods to me. The qualitative coding enabled me to produce statistical and narrative analyses about the people and mechanisms that were responsible for influencing acquisitions of art by racialized artists. However, what continued to intrigue me were the repeated words in the acquisition data. I took a particular interest in the act and perception of gift giving as a vital mechanism for the building of public collections. And I started to wonder how museums and public art collections use such linguistic codes to justify their benefit to society at large. What I needed was to be able to analyze organizational texts to help me think at scale, and that is when I turned to machine learning. Before I talk you through how I set up this experiment with UAL's Creative Computing Institute, particularly John Gillick, Ireti Olowe, and Catherine Webb, I think it is important to pause and consider the ethical and cultural context in which we work with data generated from museums, rather than dive straight into sometimes misguided solutionism. What I see is not so much the potential to dissolve alleged barriers between collections, but to dissolve barriers between our attitudes to museum research and research in museums, and who gets to join in and who does not. From the beginning, Transforming Collections has been underpinned by data ethics working commitments. It forms a guide that governs the relationship between research into bias and the generation of new artificial intelligence and machine learning developed to critique and interrogate museum data. There's already a massive literature on the discrimination and bias that's already baked into the AI we are made to use every day without consent. I take wisdom from Wendy Chun, who talks about, I quote, algorithmic authenticity and its fallacies. It is critical to remain alert when researching bias in a social context where race, gender, and other branded identities have become commodified, largely thanks to the design of extractive, discriminatory algorithms intended for accumulating power. Binaryism, this or that, yes or no, rides roughshod over nuance, awkwardness, contradiction, and the kinds of complexities that humans have evolved around. Binaryism is literally rewiring our brains, particularly as we are bombarded with more information, news, and relations than we have evolved to cope with. Binaryism is contrary to creativity. Creativity being what makes us animals, specifically human, and why I believe we are so drawn to the phenomenon that is the art museum. Stephanie Dinkins' studio experiment, Binary Calculations Are Inadequate, demonstrates an alternative to binary machine learning, where you only have the choice to indicate presence or absence. It is based around human-readable descriptions collected from as wide a variety of informed and uninformed sources as possible. In this example, I uploaded an image of Chilla Berman's Band of Gold from the British Council collection in response to a question the machine asked me, which I quote, upload an image that illustrates close attention, concern, or responsibility. Another question asks, I quote, what would you need to make your life exactly as you imagine it to be, end quote. Open questions, open conversations with the machine. Closed questions, shut them down. Those of you who are already playing with ChatGPT and your own GPTs should understand this well. While the importance of protecting the integrity of originality in our creativity is being recognized even at a government level now, the lure of money and power attached to unchecked and unbridled AI development will remain a constant challenge to museums attempting to navigate their own algorithmic authenticity. This authenticity is not about museums keeping up with the latest digital trends, but to fully understand and take an honest look at how museums can play a fundamental, tangible and textured role in mediating our inward and outward creativity. To interrogate this further, we need to take a look at the scaffolding of the texts and languages that authenticate and prop us up, and so to my experiment. My research so far on the mechanisms and relationships underpinning art acquisitions made it obvious that the language of benevolence, particularly around gift giving, heavily influences the politics and processes of representation in public collections. Over the last decade, museums have increasingly entwined the language of equity with that of benevolence as an attempt to signal an intention to move art collections from an exclusive to an inclusive arena. The aim of my experiment is partly experiential and partly epistemological. I want to see how organizational texts and languages relate to interpretive and documentary ones. In particular, I am addressing two transforming collections research questions. How can the architectures, algorithms, and relations of oppression that structure and define collections narratives be surfaced and transformed? How might art, nation, and heritage be complexified and reimagined? Relative to the large language models, LLMs, that feed commercial AI, I am creating a series of small, critical, and focused data sets to train the Transforming Collections machine learning prototype. These data sets come overwhelmingly from museums and funders' public documentation, such as collections development policies, annual reports, minutes of meetings, acquisition archives, press releases and prospectuses, and so on. These are the kinds of texts we produce to communicate with the public, stakeholders, and colleagues in a formal way. My training dataset comprises the collections development policies of all Transforming Collections contributors, collaborators, and partners, plus publicly available documentation from the Government Art Collection, Arts Council England Cultural Gift Scheme, the Arts Council Collection, British Council Collection, Art Fund, and Contemporary Art Society. Chronologically, they span from around 1919 to 2023. Once I train this data set, I will apply the algorithm to a series of test sets. The test sets will comprise similar documents, and in my experiment, I will use public documents from our main partner, Tate, for analysis. No material from Tate will have gone into training the machine. The most important factors in the development of this text analyzing machine learning prototype that differentiates it from others are the very many conversations, challenges, and iterations ongoing between the art historical museological team and the creative computing team on the project. Our approach and a significant aim of the project is to make a case for stopping and thinking before acting when it comes to developing ML and AI, and stopping and thinking before acting when it comes to problematizing texts. This has resulted in significant and rapid changes to the text analyzing prototype. It has responded to ethical concerns, for example, about binaryism and research rigor, such as the ability to tie source references to predictions. In other words, the machine learning prototype development has not just been concerned with fixing bugs. Before I created my first organizational texts database, I wanted to practice using a text analyzing classifier. Last September, using a rough and ready dataset that combined some organizational texts I had identified with generic artwork descriptions that had been in use in very early demonstrations of the prototype, I began training it using the binary system to indicate presence or absence of benevolence and equity. I was amused that after a little training, the machine predicted that any artwork described as a still life with fruit must be about equity. In a way, I felt I was not training the machine, but getting to know it. I have been journaling these little happenings as at present I am more interested in the processes than the result. I want to develop a relational and dialogic process with the machine and the experiment as a whole. So let me talk you through some examples of the language on which I have been training the machine. These examples all come from annual reports of the Contemporary Art Society. The first thing that strikes me is that the language of benevolence, here I've highlighted in red, is all the time at the heart of how we talk about the work we do, and has been for a very long time. We believe it is the right thing to do, and we want others to believe what we do is good for artists and the public. Similarly, equity in reward and representation, here marked in green, while dominating discourses about acquisition today, have never been far away, even if the actions have taken a long time to match the commitment. 100 years ago, I quote, "These are difficult times for young painters and sculptors who have to live on the proceeds of their work, and their need for some form of public patronage was never greater than now." From the same report, perhaps a little inkling of thinking about equity. This is still 100 years ago. The committee are anxious to start a separate fund for the purchase of work by contemporary artists of foreign nationality. It is felt that the public galleries in England are very deficient in representative works of foreign schools. Fast forward a bit to 40 years ago, 1984. I quote, "If we could introduce a new public to the pleasures of building contemporary art, we would also be helping the many talented artists." And let's fast forward to the latest Contemporary Art Society report from 2023, which demonstrates how active both these languages remain. Just within 3 pages of this report, we hear language or read language such as, "I would like to acknowledge the generous in-kind support of the Commission. We offer our heartfelt thanks to the sponsors of these new awards, thanks to the outstanding generosity of, with the indispensable support of the Friends of the Museum there. We would like to make a special mention here of the Friends of Reading Museum, whose generous contribution made it possible to acquire a wonderful new carving by Halima Cassel. We are grateful for their friendship and wise counsel. People come to us to gift works of art because they know we have the networks of relationships required." And so it goes on. Hundreds, thousands and thousands of these sentences. And we can also see how the language of equity and inclusivity has become a key mode of communication alongside benevolence. I quote again from last year's Contemporary Art Society report. "Muhammad's use of multiple materials reveals interconnected narratives, alert to a much more nuanced understanding of global structures and economies." Blanket, Monsters, Anna and the World is created by a contemporary woman artist and adds diversity to the collection by addressing gender balance and future exhibitions. Why material from art patrons and funders like Contemporary Art Society are so illuminating is that they also absorb the language used by artists, galleries and museums themselves. It is worth considering authorship when conducting this kind of research. Most organisational reports are written without ascribed voices and with increasing emphasis on anonymised PR-style communication. The machine will not know the difference between the two, and algorithmic authenticity has to remain something for the researcher to determine themselves. These are just randomly selected sentences that I've read in context. The machine does not read the context like we do, and the dataset is a hand-picked set of sentences, paragraphs and phrases devoid of a sense of the whole, or rather the whole feels like a decentered collective and does not afford the comfort of a well-structured referenced text. In the second iteration of this experiment, a large uncurated 10,000-row dataset was made from decimating paragraphs from the policies and annual reports discussed earlier. They were uploaded to a new edition of the text analyzer prototype, which had the ability to make 10 predictions at a time. And so I decided to also train in 10-paragraph blocks. I randomized these training rows so as not to skew the predictions, i.e., as each report had been decimated into its constituent paragraphs, they were added to the dataset in sequence, meaning paragraphs 1 to 300 might just be from one report, and paragraphs in the high thousands in the dataset might never get trained at all. However, it remains to be seen whether and how randomized data training makes a difference to the accuracy of predictions on the test data. What became immediately apparent to me when playing with initial predictions and having Wendy Chun's algorithmic authenticity in the back of my mind was the loss of source references. From where did these paragraphs originate? How could I cite them in my publications? We all know how lax even museums are when it comes to documenting key data, such as date, captions, and descriptions of images. I really did not want to fall into that trap. After a further discussion with CCI colleagues, we felt another iteration of the organizational texts dataset would be appropriate, and that's what I'm working on next. This time, we would include columns for references of file name, organization, and date. And here was also an opportunity to reduce the size of the dataset, which has admittedly already presented computational challenges, and to be more selective with the quality of the training texts. The reliance on a binary classifier to develop a critical text analyzer remains a wrinkle for most of our team. To address this and also take advantage of the incredibly rapid development and availability of GPT engines, the training prototype has integrated a task description feature and a labeling guide to enable more human prompt engineering. I personally found it especially difficult to decide whether something is or isn't there, as, I don't know, it depends, it could be, who's writing for whom. Being able to instruct the machine in this way has opened up new possibilities, and eventually we will also be able to train the machine to look for other linguistic codes by labeling each of them as part of the training process. As well as benevolence and equity, I can go further and ask the machine to detect the languages of boasting and fame. Each of these will help me research and write about how museums frame their existence in society and how cultural trends affect them at different times and places. I will always be required to review the machine's predictions, of course, as is good practice with all research-led ML work. And so to conclude, a new heuristic method for museologists is, I believe, emerging from this machine learning experiment. We are iterating and adapting with no predefined goals except to thoroughly document the processes and my experience of them. I feel a sense of responsibility ethically, but equally I have found myself letting go of some of the constraints related to process that we place on ourselves when we research art and public collections. I remain open to the emergent process in the belief that the machine will eventually teach me something too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Termina. Very, very interesting. So first of all, for Termina, so fascinating insights into binary classification. Given that the supervised categorical learning works well with such quantitative data, which is simple and easy to understand, and open-ended questions and descriptions are not, what non-categorical models are the best to explore instead? You can probably see it on the Q&A.
Yeah, I read that, and I think I'm not going to be able to answer that fully now, but I think it's the basis of a question we need to explore collectively, because what I observe has happened, and this is very much as as a user, as a researcher of machine learning as a tool for analysis, is what do you want it to do? What do you want help with answering? So my issue was being able to analyze a lot of texts at sort of scale, but to do so in a way which wasn't simply reliant on me saying, at least during the training part of a classifier, yes, because this word is here, it must mean this. Because it's absent, it must not be there. So that whole the ethical side of how you actually build up what your research questions are is really important. Technologically, I've seen some very interesting things being done in the field of prompt engineering, particularly with the more experimental versions of ChatGPT, for example. So if you're a subscriber to ChatGPT Plus, you will have access to this. However, you're then exposing the data you're putting in to the learning it's already had. So the middle ground is around prompt engineering. So with the ML prototype that we've been working on, actually over a period of time where so much has already changed in the field of machine learning, where we literally started from, we don't have a lot of choice but to go binary, to actually now we can perhaps introduce some qualitative background, something that we would recognize as thinking analysis to the machine. The prototype is combining the two. So there's probably a middle ground somewhere, but definitively I can't answer that question in terms of where can I find something that would work better. There's no substitute at the moment for just keeping hooked into the latest developments. And I genuinely think that the other best thing you can do is just give it a go yourself. Try the ChatGPTs that are available to you, see what you have access to in your organization or elsewhere. But anyway, keep in touch and see what we end up with in Transforming Collections, which might answer your question by the end of the year.
Thank you. And I think this follows up with a question I have. In previous sessions from we have presentation from Congruence Engine, where there's a lot of use of machine learning, natural language processing, and well, large language models to help identifying this kind of narrative. So I think, for me personally, I think this is essential to kind of identify this sociological and museology approaches, even though we can go to other practices in cultural heritage. So just by that linguistic determinism of the different perceptions of cultural heritage of different parts of the world, are there any challenges related to linguistic determinism on the way how collections are phrased, labeled, or managed or organized, especially modern art, in contemporary art, in your research? Or what is your perception? Can you elaborate? It's not perhaps a question, but elaborate on these challenges or visions.
Well, yeah, I think you've touched literally on the theme that the whole Transforming Collections team has been working on for the last, 2.5 years. So again, I think we've got to start from the foundation of what is it you want to know? What is it you want to perhaps change? So one of the considerations that came up, particularly from our main partner, Tate, is as soon as an artwork is acquired, a label of some description is written about it. And what we find, and other researchers who look into this will find the same thing, once you have a catalogue entry, a brief description for an object or an artwork, it tends to have a lot of staying power. It sticks over time. So what you can be reading now is a caption, unless it goes to an external exhibition, is something that could have been written in the 1960s or whatever. So in this era we're in, of actually thinking, why are we documenting in the way we are? Can we have multiple descriptions? And multivocality has also been a question we've asked our creative computing colleagues, which is, how do we create something that's multivocal? And how do we get the machine to acknowledge that multivocality, rather than say you ask a question, one question that has one answer. So I think the thinking that it's never time wasted to really think your way through the problem you're trying to solve before you then look at the right technology to help solve that. But I think that, and I'll stick my neck out here, much more than, I've dealt with linked data and open linked data for many, many, many years, and it absolutely has done some brilliant things. But what the machine learning and the GPTs are going to enable us to do is just going to be of a different order. But that applies also to academic research as well. So with the benefits, of course, come the pitfalls. So that ethical thinking is really crucial, and being able to distinguish between what we want to do ideologically with what we want to do ethically is so important. I don't know that that responds particularly to your comment, but I just say, keep in touch with Transforming Collections, because this is exactly what we've been grappling with.
A question for both of you. So one of the challenges is, how do we make use of all the tools and pipelines and workflows all the discovery projects are producing? So for example, a few weeks ago from Congruence Engine, we had this pipeline to integrate notes from historians and archivists into the into a knowledge graph, and then integrate that into the collection and then feed it back. So what would you say are the current challenges? Or, well, what would you say? How would you like to solve it? Or what is your vision or perspective on what is the current challenge of making this integrate into a single system, or to get everybody on board? What would you say is the biggest challenge for you?
The issue's not a technological one. It never has been. It's more of a question of will to collaborate, and to what extent organizations like museums want to collaborate with each other. Thinking back to the long history of attempts to aggregate collections data, mass digitization, going back to the NOF-Digi projects of the early 2000s, the will has always come from a small part of the wider sector that, in my experience, has never really translated to the organizational will to, for example, share freely. So, the recent clarification we've had about the law on copyright, for example, in copies that are made of works that are, in quotes, out of copyright. This becomes really tricky when you work with other kinds of collections like I do in my museum. But in any case, it's about organizational will. And I think that's a piece of work we need to do together, is focus less on what technology and how, because we know what these tools are now. We're all using them in different ways to help us do our work and do our research. But what isn't translating is the institutional will and compelling them through, for example, funders, about what happens to digital material that is generated, for example, from collections for public benefit or for public good. And this is exactly the reason I became interested in this phenomenon of benevolence, and that we start from an assumption that museums are good for society, and automatically, by existing, they're good things to have, but we don't really articulate properly how we do that. And certainly that hasn't been obvious from the way we share our information and share our knowledge, and who we let in to enable us to do that. So I think it is a purely political issue. I also think that some of the larger institutions, especially nationals, who are bound by very different rules to the rest of us, skew that debate too much. And perhaps our larger nationals are exceptions to the rule in the museum sector rather than the rule. So we ought to be looking more at the changes in attitudes in, for example, smaller museums, such as the one I work in, such as many around the country. We've got 1,800 accredited museums around the UK. That's a lot. They hardly get a say in these kinds of discussions, but big national organizations get a lot of say, but they don't offer very much.
Thank you. Yeah, amazing. Tom, you should be able to ask the question verbally. So will you happy to do it verbally? There you go. Welcome.
Yeah, here I am.
Yes, go ahead.
And thanks, Javier. I apologize for my name, which says BL/E Sounds. It doesn't make any sense. I'm based at the British Library, and I aggregate for Europeana Sounds and work with the other aggregators on Europeana. And I think this, I mean, there's been some really interesting discussions about how data gets shared, but we're finding, you know, first problem, aggregating, just sort of aggregating data onto portals is a lot of work, and it's a big ask for especially small data providers to provide data. Secondly, digitization. You know, it has to be. It's project based at the moment. It has to be career based. This isn't going away. This kind of job is the sort of job that you know, should keep somebody going for 40 years. And until the funding is there, we're still at the sort of, you know, we're still at the tip of the iceberg in terms of the sort of sheer amount of material that's needed. So I think, yes, let's think about reaching out and seeing how we can find all the data that's already out there. But there needs to be this massive wave to kind of get even more digitized data up there as well. That was a comment really rather than a question.
Yeah, but I think we can perfectly link it to so Joseph and Termina, do you see any benefits of what would you say are the benefits of organizations perhaps which are struggling to produce metadata? So, sorry, I'm loading the question. So what would you say are the benefits of what these tools and approaches, especially not only your approaches, but the approaches you're linking to through the TANK, I mean, all the digital humanities, not just TANK, but all the digital humanities. How is this actually helping? How do you envision this could be enabled or can enable the organizations in the cultural heritage sector? Open question for both of you.
Shall I go? I agree exactly with what Tom has said. And again, it's when we talk about digital infrastructure, we just never involve the discussion of people, properly trained, properly paid people in organizations, big and small, to do the work. So much of our cataloging work is now seen as useful as a method of community engagement or co-curation or whatever. And it can be, and it is, and certainly I've used done cataloging in that way before, but there is no substitute for actually investing in people in organizations to do the work long term with a long-term vision. And again, that comes back to what I was saying about the political will in an organization and their governing body, that they believe it's the right thing to do. So as much as we believe physically conserving a painting is important, and if it gets damaged, we raise the money to be able to conserve it, we don't have that same attitude, unfortunately, towards people, particularly people with the kind of what I call very wide-ranging curatorial skills that you need to be able to deal with this kind of very unusual kind of cultural institutional format, which is a museum, and the way we're structured in our history has dictated all of that. But, you know, we can't keep going from project to project and expect anything to really feel or look different. And it can't just remain in the hands of wealthier institutions either. So I think there is either an ostrich impression going on right now, or there's a lot of amnesia going on about the reasons why we're struggling. And Tom's absolutely right. We need people to do this work for 40 or 50 years as a career. Then we'll start seeing some really amazing things happen rather than just tickling round the edges.
Perfect. We just got more questions on the Q&A. This another question. So not well, both of you. Can you please share your experience on how to choose proper algorithms and avoid biased outputs? Anybody? So perhaps here where you're choosing your data models and.
All I'll say very simply is it's not a simple, choose this, not that answer. You can expect any pre-existing AI you use to have bias. It's the question for you really is how do you train yourself to recognize it, and what do you do to mitigate against it? So, for example, the big reason this project, Transforming Collections, is developing a homegrown prototype for machine learning is for us to be able to really get under the bonnet of what's happening with our algorithms. And so we can also theoretically train our algorithms to recognize bias. We can't ever erase it because being human is being biased. We just need to be able to recognize it, and especially recognize the insidious aspects of bias that creep into things like artwork descriptions and like catalog descriptions, the kinds of things that have been, the subject of so much attention recently, both in the media and in our sort of sector generally. So there isn't a simple answer to that, but undertaking any training to help you recognize how bias works will be of benefit. And certainly sort of keeping in touch with TC, we'll be doing demos, public demos towards the end of the year. So it's worth keeping in touch with us about that and joining in.
Perfect. Thank you. I mean, there's still a few questions, but we're running out of time, so I'm really, really sorry. I will forward these questions to both of our speakers, and we'll come back to you. But again, thank you very much, Temina.